Today's sermon is about a thing that you don't get done talking about or explaining in the context of a sermon. It's about what spiritual growth looks like in our lives, how we know when we need help, how we know when we're progressing along the path, and those words from Rilke this morning in the poem seemed really appropriate to me in voicing at least what my experience in spiritual growth has been like. My eyes already touch the sunlit hill, going far ahead of the road I've begun. So we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has inner light even from a distance and changes us even if we do not reach it, into something else which, hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave, but what we feel is the wind in our faces. I don't know if for Rilke the wind in our faces is a good thing, but I know what that feels like. Seeing a goal in the distance and it being like the sun on the horizon. Moving toward it, moving toward it, moving toward it, and never getting any closer to it. And for sure feeling the wind on my face. But I love that notion that's in those words, that we're changed by something even if we don't reach it, simply by the fact that we've chosen to face it. That our lives and our identities and our beings are transformed by what we are turning toward. A couple of weeks ago, I took my son to an aquarium for the first time. And we went and we looked at each of the tanks, and one of the most exciting animals that we encountered was this kind of jellyfish. It was in a big tank, and they were kind of moving up and down, and the tank had a light shining in it. And a little plaque, you should always read the plaque. The plaque told us that this particular kind of jellyfish moves across the waters of the ocean all day following the light of the sun. And we're planning a little sunflower ring for the summer next year for him to play in. And as we were reading about it and looking at pictures, we saw the movement of these flowers, which seemed automatically to follow the path of the sun day by day. And I was infuriated that there are creatures on this earth that by their very nature automatically face the light that feeds and heals them. Because I'm not one of those creatures. I'm sure that there are some downsides to being a jellyfish. But this thing, this creature, by its very nature, does not need to be told to be facing at all times toward the light that feeds and heals it. And then there's us. We read in our affirmation every week that we do all of these things: service, prayer, the search for knowledge, serving humanity to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. And we as human beings have this striking ability to spend a large part of our lives knowing where the divine is, turning our back to it, and running in the other direction. And when we talk about spiritual growth, it's not something that we can measure in the ways that we measure progress and success with culturally. It's not like you know that you're doing better spiritually if somebody else is doing worse. You're a winner and someone else lost. It's not like you can be a level 4 Unitarian. But I think that there are ways when I know that I'm not facing the divine. When I've spent weeks or months or years telling the same story about who I am, good stories and bad stories. When the life that I think about me isn't what other people perceive. I'm sure you've had these moments. Why doesn't everyone in this room get that I am a kind, gentle, enlightened soul? I know it to be, but they don't seem to get it. Or when I feel completely out of control of my own thoughts and actions. There's this sense of disharmony and disunity between the inner life that I want to live or believe I'm living and my behavior in the world outside of me. And for me, the spiritual life and spiritual growth includes many things, but one important element is the ability to grow over time in my awareness of which way I'm facing. And the ability over time to grow in my ability to turn back toward the things that actually heal and feed me. Easier said than done. This is not the kind of thing that you check off on a list. You don't get to say, okay, I went to a compassion seminar in 2008, check. Compassion never again. Great, I went to this weekend retreat on my marriage. Thank goodness we'll never have to work on that again. I often have people come to us and ask, why is it that we keep talking about the same issues over and over in classes and worship and retreats here? I say, because there are like 5 things that human beings keep coming back to over and over and over again. I've been recently reading the work of a Christian theologian named Henry Nouwen. He was a Catholic priest and psychologist, and he brought both of those elements into his understanding of what it meant to be a person in the act of spiritual formation. And what he says in his own language is that spiritual formation over time is the act of gradually developing the capacity to move our hearts toward God. That model, I think, works for us. This isn't a flash of light from the skies that comes down and changes you forever. It's not a one-time conversion. It's not a stepping stone process of being better than anybody else. And when he talks about the movement of our heart, what he means is not this kind of sentimental, feel-good understanding of our spirituality. He means it like the ancients meant it. That place where our intention and feelings and thoughts and willpower converge into a human being, and being able to intentionally move that part of ourselves toward the holy. He says that as human beings, we're stuck in a human condition between these polarities. At any given point, our heart is somewhere in between fear and love. Our heart is somewhere in between resentment and gratitude. We are somewhere in between denying the fact that we will die and befriending our mortality. He says that this process is one of being able to, through discipline and work and effort, move ourselves toward the holier sides of those polarities. This is nice, and it's really hard. For him, he says it takes doing a lot of the kinds of things that you would expect and we rarely ever do. He talks about the practices of regular self-reflection, about engaging almost every day with sacred wisdom literature and not reading it to know what's wrong with it, but reading it to let it teach us. He talks about regular practices of silence, like letting the silence and the prayer go a little longer than we usually do. It's uncomfortable. Talks about the regular practice of being in a community that will hold me accountable to those things, and service to others. He says, over time, fear doesn't go away. Death doesn't go away. Resentment doesn't go away. Uncertainty doesn't go away, but we grow in our ability to turn. And I really like that image, that I grow in my ability to turn toward the thing that will feed me. Now, that's harder than it sounds. I can stand up here today and say, what I'd like to suggest to you today is a practice of regularly asking yourself, which way is my heart facing? Then choose love and do it. And it's so much more difficult than that. I know that the majority of us have a year's worth of conditioning and habit that often lead us in the other direction. We've been taught by the society that we live in that certain things get us ahead when they're detrimental to our spiritual life. Understanding ourselves as consumers and competitors, understanding that power and anger and control are mechanisms for getting what we want, and we've often been told this in schools and families and churches so often that we begin to believe it. Often, I find myself turning directly away from the divine, running high speed in the other direction because it feels so powerful to do so. Some of these things feel like friends, and they're not. Anger can feel so productive. So productive. And it often can get me somewhere, and it often does, 30 miles in the wrong direction. But some of these energies, some of these sides of these polarities in our life are so seductive. We can spend years believing that they are friends when there's something very far from it. And then there's the one that I think is hardest for me. To do this, to stop and ask yourself on a regular basis, which way is my spirit facing? It means you have to know, which means you have had to see yourself. And the better you get at seeing, the more you see. And the more I see, the more I see, and I don't want to see that. Henry Nouwen talks about our capacity to grow more comfortable with exploring the house, and that when you do, you start to go into those dark corners that people haven't gone to for a while, and open that closet that nobody ever seems to open, and clean out the cobwebs that you know are there but you've been able to avoid for many years. There's something I think that can be very terrifying about a moment of pause that allows us to see ourselves. There's so much good that we see, and often we see our shadow right in front of us. So this is the practice that I'd like to suggest for you as we enter into a season that is often incredibly hectic and often very emotionally difficult for people. The practice of making space every day to pause and ask ourselves, which way am I facing? Here's the benefit. When I see that I've been looking at my shadow for days, weeks, years at a time, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but when I'm looking at my shadow, at least I know which way the sun is facing. And there's this benefit to looking and seeing our anger or our resentment or our judgment or our self-loathing and all these things that we try to avoid, because when we see them clearly, it indicates that there is another way. And there is so much pain that we inflict on ourselves and the people that we interact with that is absolutely avoidable. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Simply by the practice of knowing what is worthy of turning toward. I talked with a woman in our congregation this week who told me about the difficulty in this practice as she was with her father on the day that he died. She said that she was about to give a big presentation in front of hundreds of people at work. She'd been preparing for this presentation for a long time, and she was about to go on, and she got a phone call saying that her father was going to die. Except the person on the other end of the line told her, "Don't worry, you're not going to be able to make it before he dies. Go ahead and do the presentation. You probably won't get here." I think the person was trying to relieve her of that anxiety. So she turned toward her dying father and let the presentation be where it was going to be, and drove to the hospital as quickly as she could and opened the door, and there before her was her dying father sitting on a hospital bed with a room full of family, all literally as far away from him as they could possibly be. I'm sure you've seen this dynamic. We're afraid of death. Members of a family all almost gathered around with their backs to the walls. She said that she came in and she was absolutely shocked, angry, kind of came in and said, "What are you doing? This man is dying. He's our family," and came up and grabbed his hand and prayed with him and spoke with him, and suddenly it was like this light turned on in the room. The family started moving closer. They started having conversations, and that the entire tenor of the room changed when she was willing to turn toward befriending death, when she was willing to turn toward love instead of fear, when she was willing to turn toward inclusion instead of exclusion. But that requires going places that we don't always want to go. That requires seeing tendencies in ourselves that we don't always want to see, and it requires making big changes in our lives that we don't always want to make. But at the heart of any discussion of spiritual discipline is the knowledge that you can actually improve. To say that it's not a check mark or a one-time process, you're not going to get a certificate to hang on the wall, doesn't mean that you can't get better at it. If you're in this congregation for 30 years and don't feel like you were more compassionate than you were when you walked in, something's not working. If something hasn't changed about your ability to face the divine, then something's not working. The fact that we all show up here on a week-to-week basis, the fact that anybody gets up and of their own volition comes to join in this community of our free will and talk about the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine rests on this incredibly hopeful assumption. You can be in charge of the life that you live. We don't have to let the world happen to us. We don't have to be victims only of our environment. It doesn't mean that we can make greed go away or anger go away, that we're never going to have to face death or fear or exclusion. Those things will be with us always. But there's this hopeful assumption that we can grow in our capacity to turn toward what feeds and nourishes us. That you will be better at doing this in a year than you are now. That with practice, you won't be able to erase fear from the world, but you will be able to see that you're facing it and turn toward love quicker and quicker. I know that the weeks ahead for many of us are hectic and full of stress, and for a lot of people, a very difficult emotional time. So I hope you carry with you a little toolkit that includes giving yourself moments of pause every day. Moments of silence and stillness that are probably a little longer than you're comfortable with. And the question, which way am I facing? In the weeks ahead, may you face the holy and be changed and know love and rest time and time again. Amen.